Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Gray Matter. It's Easter weekend, and I'm in my makeshift studio in my home library. However, I can assure you there's nothing makeshift about this particular episode, in particular, the topic or my guest. Before we get to him, I want to mention I'm sporting today a sweatshirt uh, that supports missing, murdered Indigenous women, and it's part of a product line that Pure Athletics has that supports a local company called Indigimerch. Indigimerch, and you could probably find that somewhere online. And I would encourage you to do that, and that ties in actually to our guest, Mr. Grey Rath, because as we're going to hear, he has had a long career of fighting in the courts on behalf of Indigenous rights, specifically land claims. But he's also been involved very much in some very topical litigation that he and I have been working on together, but also some other cases he's been working on that are in the nature of human rights and specifically opposing government oppression. Before we get into full discussion with Jeff, as we always do, we're going to frame our discussion in terms of a few quotations. Because we have an esteemed lawyer on the show, I've got one from Louis Brandeis, who's a very, very noteworthy, very famous, and highly respected former Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court Justice. Famously said, "The greatest dangers to liberty lurk in insidious encroachment by men of zeal, well-meaning, but without understanding." And I think that's a perfect way to understand and to appreciate our current rulers in the province of Alberta and elsewhere in Canada. The second quotation is from John Locke, who is sort of the grandfather of modern liberalism. And we're going to hear from Grey Rath, who has a background in political science and who attended London School of Economics. So I thought John Locke would be an appropriate person to quote here. And he famously said that when power is given for protection and it's used for other ends, there it presently becomes a tyranny. So let's talk about our guest. We have Mr. Grey Rath, barrister and solicitor. So Jeff has used his vast amount of knowledge and experience to effectively advocate for the rights and interests of First Nations in Canada at all levels in court for 30 years. Over 30 years, actually. Jeff has been involved in winning cases for First Nations at every level of court in Canada, including the Supreme Court of Canada, Federal Court of Appeal, Federal Court Trial Division, Alberta Court of Appeal, Alberta Court of Queen's Bench, the Provincial Court of Alberta, Saskatchewan Court of Appeal, Supreme Court of British Columbia, and Ontario Court of Appeal. Jeff has also successfully advocated against numerous boards and tribunals, including the National Energy Board, the Alberta Energy and Utilities Board, the Alberta Energy Resources Conservation Board, and the British Columbia Environmental Appeal Board. Jeff also famously acted as lead counsel in a landmark Supreme Court of Canada case called Mikisew Cree Nation. Here, the court issued a unanimous 9-0 ruling, which lawyers know is rather unusual, in favor of Mikisew, in what has become a landmark decision of that court. Among other things, the Supreme Court of Canada found in that case that oral promises form part of Treaty 8. Mikisew had rights under Treaty 8 to hunt, trap, and fish in a national park. The obligation to consult arises upon the Crown obtaining either real or constructive knowledge that a right might be infringed. First Nations are entitled to a process of consultation separate and apart from the public process, and First Nations are entitled to be provided information as the nature and extent of the impact and are to be given adequate time to review this information with their own experts prior to having to engage in a consultation process with the Crown. So you can see, for a number of reasons, this is a really, really important case. Rath and Company, which is Jeff's firm, was established in 1995 as a boutique law firm, providing legal services exclusively to First Nations. Over the years, he has proven to be a strong advocate for the rights and interests of First Nations, litigating precedent-setting cases at all levels of court, including, as I said, the Supreme Court of Canada. More recently, as I said, Jeff has become very much involved, and mostly on a pro bono basis. That means unpaid, free, fighting on behalf of individuals and groups who are opposing government oppression through COVID-19 lockdown measures. And this has taken various forms. and we're going to get him to talk about this, and also some of his own fascinating personal and professional history. So, Jeff, welcome to Grey Matter. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me, Leighton. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, so before we get into some interesting topics, although you're going to be familiar to many of the people listening in or watching this podcast, I'd appreciate it if you could perhaps go through a little bit of your personal histories, just to get to know you a little bit better. I know you grew up in Calgary. I know your father has a very interesting, did some very interesting work with the Canadian military. But I would be interested in learning maybe about your high school days and your military service and university and college days. Could you give us a bit of a thumbnail sketch of your biography?
Well, my dad wasn't with the military. My father was a senior public health officer with the government of Canada. And he ended his career actually as the, senior consultant to Health and Welfare Canada, reporting directly to the Deputy Minister of Health and Cabinet on public health matters nationally across the country. Dad was, prior to that, was a regional Director General for all of Western Canada. So we were kind of like army brats. Every 4 or 5 years, Dad would be transferred from one place to another. So I ended up, even though our family's roots are in Alberta, I was born in Winnipeg. We moved back to Edmonton, where our family's from, for a number of years. Then Dad did another master's degree in epidemiology at UC Berkeley, so we were in California for a year. After that, we were in Ottawa when Dad was given that senior position with Health and Welfare Canada, negotiating the health side of the James Bay Agreement for the federal government at the request of the James Bay Cree, because my dad had such a great reputation for being somebody who actually cared about Indian health in this country. The James Bay Cree had specifically asked that he be assigned to the file. And then my father actually passed away while negotiating the James Bay Agreement in Ottawa, at which point we moved back to Alberta, where I finished, or not quite finished high school. There's a longer story there, but went from high school into full-time military service, and then from that to university, where I did an honors degree in political science, and then moved at the University of Alberta, and then moved from that to an honors degree in law at the London School of Economics.
So that's a pretty fascinating history. Getting back to a little bit to your school days, what was it about your background? Was it your father that sort of inspired your interest in politics and law, or what was it that drew you to those areas?
To be honest, I mean, my desire to go into law and to go to war with the Canadian government, as it were, and provincial governments on behalf of Indigenous people was in fact inspired by my father. After he passed away, I found out that the James Bay Agreement that he'd negotiated, in effect, broke down in a squabble between provincial and federal bureaucrats with regard to who was going to complete the sanitary sewers in one of these so-called model communities that were being set up under the James Bay Agreement. The government of Quebec was taking the position that sanitary sewers were a public health matter, which was to be paid for by the federal government. The federal government took the position that this amounted to infrastructure under the provincial side of the agreement, and the province had to pay for it. In the meantime, people had been moved into these communities. Raw sewage was running in ditches in front of their homes, and a diphtheria epidemic broke out, and 14 children were killed. So, that disgusted me to a level. And I mean, it's, I still have a hard time thinking about that without almost crying. Inspired me to, take a serious look at acting on behalf of Aboriginal people in Canada, Indigenous people in Canada, against what I saw, was the evils of provincial and federal bureaucracies, who literally were continually putting dollars and cents and sophistry and narrow technical legal interpretations, ahead of the lives of Indigenous children in this country, which unfortunately, is still going on today, and is something that we still continue to battle with, day in and day out as a law firm, as part of my life's mission.
So I know that after you completed your law degree, you went and worked for a while at a big downtown Calgary law firm. What was it that that you liked and disliked about being in a big downtown Calgary law firm like that? What made you want to leave?
Well, it was what like first of all, the firm I was at was Burnett Duckworth and Palmer, which today is one of the premier firms in the city of Calgary. I did half of my article at Mobil Oil, and then I did the other half at Burnett's, and then I stayed on at Burnett's as a for 2 years as an associate. But what ended up happening was that we kept running into ourselves because all of my clients wanted to sue governments and oil companies, and all of Burnett's clients were governments and oil companies. So after a couple of years, we parted on very amiable terms, and that's and I went to start the general counsel program at Treaty Nation on the south of Calgary, and then following that, established Rath and Company as a premier boutique Aboriginal rights firm.
So that was, I think, in about 1995. I remember meeting you for the first time in 1996. I believe you were at Enoch, and at that time there was a sort of a public meeting that you were holding in support of or in organization of the Pappas Chase claim. And I remember meeting you at that time. Yeah, and I remember meeting you. I'm thinking, wow, this guy's about my age, and he's already out on his own firm, taking on these big cases. And I remember thinking that was really cool. So you dove in, you dove in head first.
I've always operated under the mantra: don't let fear or common sense stop you.
There you go. Yeah, and so you dove right into this right away, and really made administrative law the focus of your practice, did you? That was where you really felt you were called.
For sure. But I've had some incredible support over the years. I mean, I started out actually while I was doing my undergraduate degree, even before I went to law school. Working as a researcher at the Indian Association of Alberta. Back in 1985. So I was doing research for them on Bill C-31, which was the hot topic at the time. Various other treaty rights related issues, under the mentorship of guys like, Treaty 8 Chief Lawrence Courteray. Greg Smith was the president of the Indian Association at the time. Percy Potts was the VP for Treaty 6. Floyd Smith, who, from Picani, who, I loved to death, was the elder for Treaty 7 at the time. I mean, there were some really, really amazing people there at the time. And the organization, was really involved in moving, the yardsticks of, treaty and Aboriginal rights law in the province and treaty and Aboriginal rights advocacy, in the province. So, I left the IAA to go to law school in London. Through my tenure in London, I kept, being drugged back into, Indigenous issues, doing research for the organization, while I was in London. And, I literally came back to Calgary as an articling student, with almost the ability to build, a full-time practice in the area of treaty and Aboriginal rights law, as a result of the, of the support, of all of my mentors and friends from the Indian Association of Alberta, who are still, close friends of mine to this day.
I want to get into some of the COVID-19 activities that you're involved in. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about the Mikisew case. And I want to hear from you about what that experience was like, taking that case all the way through to the Supreme Court of Canada, and also maybe explain to people who don't know much about it why that case is so significant, so salient in Canadian law.
Well, obviously, that case was one of the highlights of my career. It was a fairly interesting and activist panel, at the Supreme Court. It was even though the panel was chaired by Beverly McLaughlin, the one guy that I remember the most from the panel was actually two guys, were Jack Major and Justice Binney, because Jack Major was just having a lot of fun with me at my expense and going out of his way to gobble up the 45 minutes of time that I had in front of the court with with fairly pointed questions as Jack can do, but to me seemed literally, geared to throw me off my game. And the problem was, it was a very activist panel in that case. They all had questions, and they'd be rippling from one end of the bench to the other. And, you're sort of tasked with this intellectual exercise of trying to get your entire 45-minute argument in a manner that was coherent and made sense, but in the context of all of these questions that you're getting from one end of the bench to the other. And, and again, of course, Jack Major, I felt was trying to disrupt what I was doing to a certain degree. And at one point, Justice Binney, and to this day I'm grateful, decided to intervene on my behalf. And he said, and I can't even remember what the questions were now, but Justice Binney pipes up and says, "Well, Mr. Rath," he says, "isn't the answer to almost all of my learned friend, Justice Major's questions simply this?" And then he states the perfect answer for the record. And I said, "Of course it is, my Lord Justice. And for the record, I'll plot that answer." And at that point, you could just see Jack, Justice Major, having sort of been caught out on what he was doing, kind of smirking a little bit and understanding that it was time to sit down and let me, as much as I could, get on with my argument in the 45 minutes that we had to make it. So it was a really interesting experience. And of course, I was thrilled. It was Justice Binney that wrote for the 9-0 majority, which was phenomenal. And to this day, I think it's one of the most well-written, well-reasoned, decisions in the area of consultation law that's ever come out of the Supreme Court of Canada. And of course, there were a number of factors that came out of it, like the fact that the Supreme Court recognized that the oral promises of the Commissioner's report form part of the treaty. Frankly, I don't think enough has been done with that by people that practice in the field, but that was a huge win that came out of that case. Especially if you put it together with the Grassy Narrows decision. And now I'm getting a little bit technical, but that's, that was extreme. I thought that was, in a lot of ways, that case to this day is the high watermark of treaty law in Canada. In the context of the way that the Supreme Court both interpreted and applied Treaty 8 and made it clear that, where provincial governments, and this is actually what Mikisew led directly to the recent Blueberry decision in British Columbia that's changing the map of Indigenous rights in BC. It's that line from Mikisew that says, once you take up so much land in the treaty, that to the extent that a meaningful right can no longer be exercised, this is no longer, simply an infringement of Aboriginal or treaty rights, but a violation of treaty rights, which can lead directly to damages being paid, was some pretty strong language from the Supreme Court. And, I think has laid the foundation, for some pretty amazing cases that followed it, for sure.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about how you got involved in COVID-19 litigation. So obviously, something of a departure for you.
Not really. If you think about it, I'm going to blame that on my father as well.
Well,
and I hope he's looking down and he's not unhappy with me. But
still within the realm of constitutional law, though, right?
In a public health family. My father was was the most senior public health doctor in Canada. If he were alive, he would have been Theresa Tam. If there was an epidemic that broke out in Canada, Dad was the most qualified guy to deal with it. He held an equivalent rank of Brigadier General in the Canadian Armed Forces. He was basically in charge of, all of the, what were then level 4 labs in Canada, including the lab at Suffield in Alberta. And if there were any outbreaks or epidemics that came out of any of that, Dad would have been the point guy, on all of this stuff, right? So, and my mom was a public health nurse. She ran that's how Mom and Dad met. She ran the Edmonton agency and was the public health nurse for all of the First Nations, from Edmonton North up to Anzac and Fort McMurray and, Paul Band and Alexis and, that whole area. So, I always say that I came to the, both the practice of, Indigenous law, honestly, having almost half grown up on Indian reserves in Canada with my mom and my dad. And then, with regard to the COVID epidemic, the first thing that happened, of course, you have all these people trying to sow panic in society. And, of course, my poor wife, we have an 11-year-old daughter, and, all of this stuff is extremely terrifying. And right at the very outset of this, back in March of 2020, I turned to my wife, I got my calculator out and started punching numbers. And I said, honey, I don't know what the hell's going on, but this isn't an actual pandemic. And there, this is, could be some form of, public health issue. But I said, if you look at the numbers, when they're publishing those stupid death clocks every day, I said, and you look at, whether it's Canada or globally or whatever it is, the mortality rate on this thing, by the numbers is 0.004%. So to me, this isn't, a crisis. All the modeling makes no sense because it's projecting, mortality rates of like 2%, and they're a fraction of that. And I said, I'm really not sure what the hell's going on, but it's certainly not as bad as everybody's making it out to be. And it really doesn't seem to be causing any more mortality than a bad flu season. So, from the outset, because of my background and, and having grown up with an epidemiologist, I was really concerned from the outset that we were dealing, with something different than a real public health emergency. The other thing is that I was brought up in a family where, my grandmother at the age of 80, and I mean, keep in mind, my grandmother was the poster child for the liquor and tobacco lobby. Every day at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, she'd have her genteel menthol cigarette with her rye and water, right? And, but I mean, from the age of 80 pretty much onward, all of her brothers, she was from a large French Catholic family. Most of her brothers and sisters had died. Her husband had died. All of her friends and cohorts had died and had already passed on. And, she made it very clear, we were all taught growing up that, your job as a human being, once you get into your 80s and 90s, is to simply, pass on with as much grace and dignity as you can muster while being as small a burden on your family as you possibly can be. And, we were brought up quite comfortable with the idea that literally the job of people in their 80s, 90s, and 100s was to pass on, right? So, at the outset of this thing, the fact that, our society is being turned inside out, businesses are being destroyed, young people's lives are being ruined. We're raising children effectively in a Skinner box by making children who are supposed to be, learning how to communicate with one another non-verbally, et cetera, to put masks over their faces like they're some sort of robot, et cetera, et cetera. This was not the way I was brought up, and this isn't anything that accorded with, the worldview or the values, of my family as they were taught to me, right? So, and again, as much as everybody, for every family that has somebody in their 80s, 90s, or 100s that passes on, it's obviously a tragedy to that family. But, my mother died at the age of 96 in the middle of all of this foolishness. Obviously, any individual death is a tragedy to the family, but, the idea that somehow or other society needs to be turned inside out so that we can give people in their 80s, 90s, or 100s who are already dying from 3 or 4 different things, that's what comorbidities are, that, that we should literally be destroying the lives of children, destroying businesses of young adults, driving young people to commit suicide so that people, and I hate to quote Dennis Leary on this on No Cure for Cancer, but for people that are living the crappiest years of their lives so they can have another 3 or 4 months of crappy months, and destroying the rest of the society in the process never made any sense to me, at a human or an intuitive level.
Right.
And again, to finish that thought, I'm a big believer in the fact that all of those people should have been afforded far better protection than they were afforded. And, there are a lot of other measures that should have been taken to protect our senior population. Completely destroying the economy of this province and the economy of Canada was something that never should have happened.
Right. No, you make a great point. And we used to have something called natural causes. You remember that? Where people would die of natural causes. One of those natural causes were things like flus and pneumonias. And unfortunately, we don't think of them in those ways. And so we speak of, it seems somewhat odd, like taking the example of your mother, and please accept my condolences, but someone who it sounds as though lived a very rich, very full life as a nurse, raising a family, to die at 96 years of age doesn't sound like a tragedy to me. It sounds like somebody who has a really, that's a great achievement, and we shouldn't be thinking of someone's death like that in terms of a tragedy, I don't think. Would you agree?
Well, no, and the other thing, I mean, she passed away from a good old fashioned bout of pneumonia, right?
Right.
And what we had to go through, because of these bullshit, excuse my language, I mean, bullshit COVID restrictions in and around my mother's passing, was cruel and unusual. First of all, they immediately wanted to put her in palliative care the minute she walked into the hospital. And I said, well, wait a minute. I said, she's dehydrated, and, she obviously has, she has a bladder infection. And it was, let go on too long at the, at the hospital, or at the, care home that she was in. And, and I said, we need to treat for that. She goes, well, she's a DNR. I said, well, I'm not asking you to resuscitate her. I'm asking you to practice basic medicine so she can die with dignity. So, yeah, I want you to run an IV, and I want you to give her antibiotics for the infection. And, oh, well, if we do that, we can't allow the rest of your family to visit because she's not going to be palliative then. And of course, I'm saying, are you people insane? Right? We all know that she's dying, right? Mm-hmm. So why are we playing this game? Right? Don't talk to me about tests and x-rays and how uncomfortable this is going to be and all the rest of it. I said, she's a full DNR. So what are you going to take x-rays for anyway? You're not doing surgery at her age. I just want her, to die with dignity. And I was of the view that given, the amount of money that I've contributed to the tax system over the years, and my mother and my father have contributed to the tax system over the years, we were entitled to basic medical care and basic dignity in the way that my mother was being treated in hospital. Mm-hmm. And I mean, so, thankfully, we were able to achieve, what as a family we wanted to achieve for her. We were constantly being put in a position of them wanting to euthanize my mother. And I said, I'm sorry, but, I was brought up as a Catholic, and I'm not very comfortable with being put in that position. And, I want her made as comfortable as possible, however we need to do that. And whatever that looks like, is what we're going to do. But it was just this constant, fight with the palliative care team, who literally wanted her to die of starvation and dehydration. Well, lecturing me on, it means something different at this stage of life, et cetera, et cetera. You just have to give us the okay to let your mother starve and dehydrate to death. Which is a horrible position to put anybody in. Right. That's healthcare. That's healthcare in Alberta.
Mm-hmm. What you just described is somewhat analogous to the situation of Tori Tanner, who, as you know, is one of the applicants in the case that you and I have been working on together, where they had a parent who went into hospital with a relatively minor health situation, was treated presumptively as COVID, did not have COVID. Actually, it came out that they had actually never been tested, but were put into a COVID ward and subsequently became ill and died. So that's just another, to reinforce what happened to you, sadly is not unique. Many mistakes were made, errors in judgment in the way that our most vulnerable populations were treated. By way of segue, I'm interested to know, how did you come to meet Rebecca Ingram?
I'll come to that in a second. I just want to finish my story because it goes back to my concerns from the outset about the pandemic, having been largely created, by governments for the purposes of government, with the full collusion of big media. And it was, in and around my mom's passing that I was really stricken with, not only the amount of fake news being promulgated on TV, but how far the control of the media went in our society. So following my mom's passing, I wanted to write, her obituary. So, and of course my mother had an incredible career, nursed the polio epidemic in the 50s, ran the nursing school at the General, all those types of things. So I wanted that, captured in this, obituary. But the other thing was that, dealing with grief, again, you try to, in our family, we always try to maintain some sort of sense of humor around the most horrible circumstances. And, this is very much the way my mother was as a human being. So I wanted her obituary to reflect that. So I literally wrote into her obituary that Gilda Graves Rath passed away peacefully in her sleep from a good old-fashioned bout of pneumonia. And then I added, to have died from a Chinese cold bug in the middle of a phony public health crisis would have offended her sensibilities as a public health nurse. Okay, so I wrote that into her obit. The Herald edited that out of my mother's obituary without my consent or without my permission.
Wow.
Because heaven forbid, that in November of 2020, that anybody even be allowed to pay $4,000 or $5,000 by way of advertising to make fun of, what I've maintained from the outset has been a public health management crisis, rather than a bona fide public health crisis.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
I guess, to a certain degree, I don't know if that leads into Rebecca Ingram, but, because of the work that I was doing and because I was becoming progressively more public with my concern and disdain for the way that things were being run, I was retained by Rebecca. And, and it was specifically with regard to, those stupid Christmas lockdown orders of Deana Hinshaw's, going into Christmas of 2020, where, single people could have 2 friends and people that were married could have so many friends. But, oh, heaven forbid that all of your friends get together in your house over Christmas because, oh my God, we've got to stop the spread, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, and it was in and around that stupidity that I was being retained. And of course, at the time, and I think both your work and our office's work, have really succeeded in blunting some of the stupider measures that they imposed, because every time it would seem to me that we would file something that would highlight something that they were doing that was particularly stupid, such as telling 16, 17, and 18-year-old kids that they couldn't go to high school in person, but they could leave the high school if they were 18 or older, go to the local casino, go to the local strip club, go to whatever, which were all left open while they were closing high schools down. If you remember that, the fact that we put that in our pleadings, led to the closure of the strip clubs, the casinos, et cetera. I still don't think that was the right response from the government. The response should have been to open all of it up. But, we were forcing them to react the whole way through, with regard to what they've been doing with their public health measures. As like I saw just last week, and I don't know if you caught it, but, dear Dr. Hinshaw has now announced, some sort of outpatient treatment program where they're going to make, 2 drugs available, for outpatient treatment. There's probably 2 of the worst drugs available for outpatient treatment, being remdesivir and Paxlovid, which both have way more side effects than ivermectin or fluvoxamine or any of the other drugs that have been proven to be effective that Deana Hinshaw wants to ignore. But, again, I think you and I, by forcing those issues, have forced Deana Hinshaw to at least consider outpatient treatment on a going forward basis. And there's been lots of other markers like that along the way, where we've been able to push public policy, in a direction towards common sense. But, given the people that are implementing it, it's always hit and miss.
Yeah, another great example of what you're talking about that I would cite is the removal of the mandatory vaccination that was in the amendments to the Public Health Act, but which was taken out. What I would say in direct reaction to the pleadings that we had filed. I think that was another one that was sort of a big victory that isn't talked about very much. It was certainly suppressed by the media, but in hindsight, that was a huge one. If that one had gone through, the situation in Alberta, I think, would have been much, much worse for a lot of people. So you met Rebecca Ingram. Would that have been around November, December of 2020?
Yeah, it would have been. It would have either been shortly before or after my mom passed away in November. So, it was in and around November of 2020.
So, were you looking at that time for an opportunity to get involved professionally in some type of a challenge? So this was sort of a timely thing, or is it just kind of something that came along?
I wouldn't say I was looking for an opportunity, because I mean, as you know, most of my career, I mean, we've never really chased cases. You know, it's
Right.
they always tend to come to us. But
Hmm.
I was becoming progressive, certainly from from March of 2020 onward. I was becoming progressively concerned with the steady and constant erosion of our civil rights and civil liberties in Alberta, under the guise of public health, which both from my knowledge and experience, was completely unnecessary. In terms of the manner in which they were implementing these measures. So, I was becoming progressively more and more concerned about what was going on. And, I think I was retained by, Rebecca sort of at the height of, my wanting to do something, with regard to these issues. But, we're not, I'm not in the habit of chasing cases. So it was, I guess sort of providential in terms of Rebecca coming to us when she did.
Hmm.
So.
Yeah, and you do have a history of being very politically active, though, don't you, Jeff? Obviously, from listening to you, you have a very conservative / libertarian approach to politics, but you've been very actively involved in politics in the province of Alberta over the years, haven't you?
Well, I guess I'm an active member of society. I mean, I've done a lot of, most of the advocacy that I've done previously has been on behalf of, of Indigenous people, in Canada and Alberta, and out of my concerns for the fact that we still have Indigenous people in Alberta literally living in third world conditions, that would literally make your, make your heart break, were you to visit some of the First Nations that I visited. In terms of the conditions that these people are still forced to live in, by the Trudeau government. But that having been said, I mean, I've always, been concerned, about the manner in which we're governed. I mean, to say that I'm conservative, I'm a Canadian. I mean, I believe in, a social safety net. I believe in, I believe in the fact that the less fortunate in our society, need to be supported by, people that can, afford to do that. But I've always been of the view that we need to have a functional economy within which to support, these types of programs. And that's what seems to have gotten lost along the way. It's like Keynesian economics run rampant, where, we don't spend in times of trouble and then try to build up surpluses, in stronger economic times. It just seems we spend regardless, as if there's an endless printing press of money that we can keep going to. And I mean, you just have to look at, what happened to the Weimar Republic, following these same foolish monetary policies that the Trudeau government's now following, to see what the conclusion of that was, in terms of the complete devastation of that economy, which led directly to Hitler and the Second World War. Yeah. And I honestly believe we're on the same, I'm a student of history. I'm a student of international relations and politics and economics. And I really feel that we're on that same path right now, because we're being guided by the foolish. I mean, let's look at the whole CERB program that, that our benighted prime minister brought in, $600 billion to teach a bunch of able-bodied young people to sit at home in mommy and daddy's basement, play Nintendo, smoke legal dope, and be paid $2,000 a month to do it. And now the Liberal government wants to institutionalize that through the Universal Basic Income program, starting at the age of 17. So I can tell you what my 16-year-old self would have said to the idea of, hey, if you vote for, the Liberal Party or vote for the NDP, when you turn 17, you can drop out of high school. You don't need to have a plan to get a job. You don't have to have a plan to go to university. You don't have to make anything of yourself. You can drop out of high school at the age of 17, stay at home in your mommy and daddy's basement or their garage, and we're going to give you $2,000 a month to buy beer and muscle car parts. I'll tell you how my 16-year-old self would have voted, because that's the other thing. It's the companion legislation to the to S233 is a bill called S201, where the Liberals want to lower the voting age to 16, so 16-year-olds can vote themselves a $2,000 paycheck when they turn 17. I mean, it's, it flies in the face of everything that I was brought up to believe. It flies in the face of everything that I believe this country is. And, to me, I'll fight that to my death, because I think it's, it's literally the death of this country. And this is a country that my child has to live in. Right. And they're going to destroy it, with these foolish policies that have no concept of helping people be their best selves, as opposed to becoming useless parasites dependent on government handouts.
It's fascinating that you would say that. It reminds me of something that Margaret Thatcher famously said about socialist governance and economics, and that is that eventually the government runs out of other people's money.
But my question here, and this is a serious question, right?
Yeah.
Does that make me a conservative, or a libertarian, or does that just make me somebody who's been studying economics since they went to school, in the early 1980s, and where we were literally shown, as a macroeconomic case, the difference between the liberalized unemployment insurance rates of the 70s, so the tightening up of unemployment, and the fact that the liberalized unemployment rates, all they did, or insurance programs, all they did was add 2 to 3% to the real unemployment rate in the country, because so many people didn't have to work. I mean, I'm old enough to remember, guys that would jokingly refer to themselves as being on the UI ski team, right? So you'd have a house full of able-bodied men, right, in their early 20s, right, all collecting UI, because I think at the time you only had to work 12 weeks to, qualify, right? And, so they were all collecting, the full UI. So there was always a stack of full 2-4s of beer next to the fridge. The fridge was always loaded with, cold beer. There was always a big bowl of grass on the table because everybody would chip into the weed fund. And every 12 weeks or so, everybody would be laughing at the poor SOB that would actually have to go to work for 12 weeks to requalify, where everybody else was heading off to Sunshine or Lake Louise or whatever, for another weekend skiing paid for by the Canadian government. And I mean, that's what they want to turn our country back into. And I just think it's wrong.
The other thing that what you're saying reminds me of, I'm working my way through a book right now written by Ray Dalio. It's called The History of Change. And actually what he does is he looks at economic and historical patterns over the last 500 years. And of course, he marks how they don't repeat, but they re-arise, they renovate. And it's his view that right now we're going through a period of turbulence. It's very similar to what was going on in the last century between 1930 and 1945. And that's somewhat frightening because, as you know, within that period was a very destructive war. So these markers, these things that you're talking about, they do have impacts that go far beyond just law and politics and economics and economics, don't they? These are fundamentally dangerous things that are being done that cause tremendous conflict, especially class conflict, that inevitably leads to war. At least that's the opinion of some people like Ray Dalio and others. Would you agree with that? That's part of the reason why we're seeing a rise in military conflicts in places like Ukraine, Taiwan, Iran, and elsewhere?
I don't know if I'd necessarily go that far. I mean, I'm very much of the school of thought that attributes what's going on in the Ukraine and any potential problems, with Taiwan, with the weakness of the current American administration from a foreign policy perspective. We've gone back to paying off terrorist regimes like Iran. We're turning a blind eye to Putin's imperial ambitions. The Joe Biden, who literally, if you've been following all the Hunter Biden stuff, the entire Biden family appears to have already been bought off by China Inc. So I don't think that Joe Biden's in any position to take a strong position vis-a-vis China. And on top of it, when you look at the Democrat Party base in the United States, so many, whether it's, Walt Disney or any of these companies that are so vested in, being able to do business in China, and the old, the old world order / new world order, where China is the center of the universe and we're all just to be consumerist cogs, for the Chinese plastic toy machine. I think that, is more of an issue. What I'm concerned about is more the breakdown of societies, right? Because, we see, people like Putin, and we see people, like, Chairman Xi, they're very long-term thinkers. I think they're actively engaged in a strategy that will allow the US dollar to be replaced, as the global currency. While we're busy printing money and putting people on welfare, they're busy amassing commodities. They're busy building up their gold reserves, et cetera, et cetera. And, I think we get to a point where, where Trudeau spends us into, the condition of the Weimar Republic. And then, China and Russia with their gold reserves just come up and buy up all of our natural resources, lock, stock, and barrel, for literally pennies on the dollar, given, what can only be the collapse of the Canadian currency if they keep following the policies that they're following. So that's, how I see this. And I mean, does that mean there's a war? No, I think at the end of the day, we end up, we literally end up being, economically colonized by China and Russia, who end up being in a position to buy up the most important parts of our economy. And certainly they're not going to be so foolish as to buy into, all of the Tides Foundation ridiculousness on carbon and otherwise. They'll be the ones demanding pipelines and building pipelines and whatever, and they're going to be in an economic position to force them. And then they'll have all of their, and certainly all of their agents within the Tides Foundation and elsewhere that have been busily destroying the Canadian oil and gas industry and elsewhere, will simply stand down and let them do it. And life will go on, very well for them, but probably not so well for citizens of Canada. To me, it's a real, to me, I mean, this kind of profligate spending and the destruction of our national economy is probably the biggest national security issue that we face.
Hence, people's strong reactions to things like the World Economic Forum, and seeing that as not only a threat, but really something that is tantamount to treason.
Well, but on top of it, I think people are right to be concerned about the World Economic Forum, right? It's literally a club for all of those people that want to profit on gross public mismanagement. I mean, like Joe Biden's brother, goes from being building houses in Iraq to, to owning, large, health sciences companies. Surprise, surprise. Nancy Pelosi's family, heavily invested in China, heavily invested in biomedical and other things, right? We haven't got to the depths of Trudeau's corruption, but I mean, lots of people there are lots of allegations floating around about the extent to which, the Trudeau Family Foundation may have interests, in various biomedical corporations that profit from, the various vaccine patents. Whether any of this is true or not, I certainly am not in a position to comment because I haven't really dug in depth. But, certainly from what we've seen about the way the Trudeau family operates, hundreds of millions of dollars to charities friendly to his mother and his brother and, all of those types of things. I mean, I certainly wouldn't put it outside the realm of the possible. And we know we have an RCMP, that isn't interested in investigating to any great degree. So, there's no checks and balances on any of that. And it's, it's deeply, as a citizen, it's very concerning to me.
Well, that's true. We have a prime minister who refers to any expression of patriotism as over nationalism. I'm not even sure.
God! I mean, I've got some of it, but following the protests in Ottawa, it's if you wave a Canadian flag from your vehicle, you're a right-wing extremist. So the Canadian flag itself, according to Trudeau and all of his ilk, is now a symbol of right-wing extremism in Canada. Right. This is the stupidity that we're dealing with, at the highest levels in our country, and it's deeply, deeply troubling to me.
So let's segue from there back into the case that everyone is interested in hearing from you about, the big case involving Rebecca Ingram and others. So, of course, recently, this case has been going in fits and starts through the courts. I think it's fair to say it's become something of a protracted litigation, having started back in late 2020. And now we had a recent week or so of trial time during which Deana Hinshaw was cross-examined. I'm going to set this up a little bit and then let you take it away. The way that I read the cross-examination of Deana Hinshaw is that I did most of it, but people only remember the parts that you did. So take it away, Jeff. Talk to us about the trial, how you think it's going, and where you think it's going, and why.
Well, I don't know if it's fair to say you did most of it, but I mean, I think the problem was that for whatever reason, Nicholas Parker appeared to be more concerned about some of the questions that I was asking than some of the questions that you were asking.
Yeah.
And was more involved in continually objecting to everything that I was doing on an ongoing basis to disrupt, to disrupt, us getting to the bottom of issues that you and I were both, of the view needed to be resolved. So, as far as I'm concerned, the case was remarkable on a number of levels. I mean, one of the biggest things that, I think, was the most interesting was the degree to which Dr. Hinshaw was continually throwing Jason Kenney under the bus by making it clear that these so-called chief medical officer health orders weren't her orders, and that they were only, that she would only provide advice to Jason Kenney, and that it would be the Kenney cabinet that would then direct her as to what her orders should be. So, remarkable on a couple levels. I mean, it's pretty obvious to me that they're setting her up as a scapegoat, for all of this at the end of the day. But she's not going willingly to the altar, right? And is fighting back to the degree that she can, claiming that, whatever orders she issued weren't really her orders. So I think that's, that creates some interesting issues from a legal perspective. The other thing that I found really remarkable was the fact that she admitted under oath that she didn't know what the difference, whether I call it natural immunity. She insists on the term post-infection immunity because she wants to make it clear that people have to get sick or get infected before they get immunity from COVID. I'm not sure what the propaganda point was that she was making there, but I'm sure there was one. But in any event, that she didn't know what the difference was between natural immunity in terms of its effectiveness from people that have been previously infected versus vaccinated immunity. Because, of course, throughout, they've been trying to spin this story that somehow or other, the vaccines were the answer to everything. Everybody has to get vaccinated. Parents have to get their children vaccinated, even though all the evidence is that the vaccines are more harmful to children than COVID, et cetera, et cetera. So they're spinning this story. And then she admits under oath that she doesn't know whether natural immunity is stronger than vaccinated immunity, from an empirical basis. So on that basis alone, it really calls into question, her bona fides, and it really calls into question every decision that she was making in and around locking people up in their homes in the hope that we could have this really non-effective vaccine being, pushed out to the public and forced on people, by way of mandates and otherwise, right? So I thought that was really, remarkable. And then, just generally, her entire approach to everything in and around the issue of suicides, I felt was really, really disturbing and really shocking, where she is prepared to acknowledge that her orders may have contributed to some degree to business bankruptcies or to, or to suicides in the province, but she didn't know to what degree because she never because that was in the purview of the chief medical examiner. And then when she was asked whether she'd actually consulted the chief medical examiner with regard to what degree to which he felt her orders were killing people in the province, she advised that she didn't consult with him with regard to that issue. So to me, it certainly demonstrated a lack of care, a lack of concern for the citizens of this province that, to me was, was quite, I'm not going to go over, I need to be careful in terms of my words. I feel really strongly about this. Was really shocking, I think, is the best thing that I could say. And in fact, I was so disturbed by it. I was, I authored a letter that you and I both signed to the chief medical examiner, who's yet to respond, incidentally, demanding that all the suicides that took place in 2021 be the subject of an inquiry under the Fatalities Inquiries Act to determine, how many suicides were in fact directly attributable to Dr. Hinshaw's orders. Because the simple fact of the matter is, as you know, fewer than 25 people under the age of 30 have allegedly died from COVID. So, if there's more than 35 suicides attributable to Dr. Hinshaw's orders, it's to people under 30, it's fair to say that Dr. Hinshaw has killed more people under the age of 30 than COVID. And I think that's something that the people of this province are entitled to know.
I recall that question being put to her and the objection. I want to bring you back, Jeff, to this issue of jurisdiction. And you described it as sort of passing the buck, because a few of the people who watched the trial or listened to it have asked me, it sort of left off like a 1940s cliffhanger where the judge was going to go away off in a room and ask Dr. Hinshaw a few questions. Could you perhaps just elaborate on that process, why you thought that issue was so important, and then just go into a brief explanation for people about what that process is, that sort of in-camera questioning process is, and what the judge is going to do coming out of that? Because I don't think many people really understand that part of it.
Well, I'm as in the dark as you are in terms of what the judge might do. Right? But, we're dealing with a case where the decision maker, the person we all presumed was the decision maker, Dr. Deana Hinshaw, issuing orders that allegedly, in her opinion, were within her power to do whatever was required, in her opinion, to abate the public health crisis. Well, and instead of finding out that this was in her opinion, right, it was actually the opinion of cabinet, and she's being told what to do by cabinet. I thought it was important to ask whether she had in fact had any of her advice or recommendations overruled and replaced with orders directly from cabinet. Because one of the things we pled is that the orders themselves are ultra vires Deena Hinshaw, because they're not chief medical officer of health orders, they're cabinet orders, which under the law should be promulgated under the Emergencies Act, Section 19, at which point you could shield them from cabinet confidentiality. Now, for our listeners, and this is a bit of a technical legal point, the purpose of cabinet confidentiality, I think, is a good one, and that is cabinet discussions, by and large, need to be frank and open, and cabinet ministers who may disagree with the premier, should be able to discuss their views openly and frankly, without, being held, to public, accountability for these views. Because if their views don't prevail at the end of the day, they're still going to be required under the system of responsible government to support the government decision overall, and their personal views shouldn't be held up to attack the government. By and large, that's the reason for the doctrine, as set out by the Supreme Court of Canada. We weren't asking specifically, for transcripts of what went on in cabinet. We weren't asking for the individual views of individual cabinet ministers. We were simply asking to what degree her advice was followed or not followed, and were these really chief medical officer of health decisions, or were these political decisions dressed up as chief medical officer of health decisions? And I thought that was a very important question to have answered, both in terms of Dr. Hinshaw's credibility and in terms of the fact that we specifically pled that the orders were ultra vires, the chief medical officer of health under Section 29 of the Public Health Act. So, as usual, with questions I thought were important to be answered, our friend Nicholas Parker objected on the grounds of cabinet confidentiality. They had a certificate that they'd had drafted back in February that they were holding, in their back pocket.
And a detailed brief.
Waiting to ambush us at hearing, which they did. No surprises there. So anyway, the whole thing then went off into the realm of legal argument, where they submitted their legal arguments, we submitted ours, and the judge is now reserved on those issues to determine whether or not cabinet confidentiality does or doesn't apply. And while she had Dr. Hinshaw there and under oath, she met with Dr. Hinshaw in camera to ask Dr. Hinshaw several questions in and around the issue of whether or not Dr. Hinshaw's advice had been overridden by cabinet, or if orders had been made more stringent rather than less stringent, in and around COVID-19, which decisions or which questions will only be published and only be made available to us in the event that the learned justice overrules Nicholas Parker's objections on the grounds of cabinet privilege. The other thing that's kind of interesting about this, because I kind of find it to be a bit of a surprising tactic, and it's one that I don't find generally serves counsel very well, and is very rarely utilized, and that is threatening the judge with an appeal prior to her ruling, which is what we saw Nicholas Parker doing. I mean, the government of Alberta is so touchy about this issue that they went out of their way to tell the learned justice that if she rules in favor of the of the plaintiffs in this case on the issue of cabinet privilege, they're going to need to apply for an immediate stay of proceedings so they can immediately go to the Court of Appeal on an emergency basis, to protect the Kenney cabinet from having to disclose the degree to which they interfered in medical decisions being made by the chief medical officer of health in the context of what we were sold as a populace, were medical decisions rather than political decisions. So, obviously we anxiously await the learned justice's ruling, in this regard, and then we'll see whether or not the threats of appellate proceedings that have already been levied by the government of Alberta, will follow through or not, in the context of what the learned justice is doing. So, I hope that explains the issue as best, so that people.
Yeah, it does. It does.
But that's where things are at.
So
it's an odd little sideshow within the proceedings, for sure.
Right. So just talking a little bit about the broader issue in the case, which I'm going to distill down to this, and you can disagree with this if you like. Feel free to do so. I see our position is basically saying that the measures employed by the government of Alberta to deal with the COVID-19 situation, I won't call it a pandemic, that is these non-pharmaceutical interventions, or people call them lockdown measures, that the harms caused by them are measurable, and we know that they vastly outstrip and are more severe than any benefit that they might have produced, and that benefit is dubious. That seems to be the crux of the case. But the question why I want to ask you is, why is maybe the answer is obvious, and I'm going to ask you this as a two-parter. First of all, why are lockdowns so bad? And secondly, why is the government of Alberta so afraid to acknowledge that they're bad? And feel free to refer to a certain Johns Hopkins study that was a subject of much debate in the case.
Well, first of all, from the outset, I think anytime the governments interfere with civil liberties, as a first recourse rather than a last recourse, I'm really concerned, right? I mean, from the outset, with we know where the 15 days to stop the spread went. And I mean, I'll state for the record that from the outset, I've been very much of the view that, for those of us that aren't afraid to die, people that are afraid to die should stay home. It's pretty commonsensical. If you think that the world is out to get you and you're gonna die from a cold bug, then stay home. Because at the end of the day, everybody's responsible for their own health. And to me, there's never been any cogent evidence from the outset that other than for people over the age of 65, that this disease that we've been dealing with is any more serious than, a super bad cold or a super bad flu. And in fact, I was reading statistics this morning that indicate that the flu of 68, 69, 1968, 1969 killed more people than COVID.
Hong Kong flu, yeah.
Yeah.
It's Summer of Love. They had
all of
Woodstock
this
in the middle of that.
For that, right?
Mhm.
The other thing that I've been concerned about from the outset is this idea that somehow, and this is, the most basic right in society, is the right to informed consent to medical procedures. And from the outset, the idea that government or government authorities or whatever it is can physically coerce people into being vaccinated against their will, is complete anathema to me. And, and they say, oh, we're not coercing anybody. I mean, and I wasn't allowed to ask this question, but Deana Hinshaw publicly, oh, we're not coercing anybody. We're engaged in quote unquote structural encouragement. I mean, there's some newspeak if ever there was any, right? And no, we're not threatening people with their lives and livelihoods and telling people that they're going to lose their job and lose their home and not be able to feed their kids and all this other stuff if they don't get vaccinated. That's not coercion. That's structural encouragement, kiddies.
George Orwell
right?
would be so proud.
This kind of foolishness just drives me mad. Because I refuse to live in the world of the stupid, and where what's up is down and black is purple, and I mean all this idiocy that we've been living throughout the pandemic. And then of course, because of my involvement, not just in this case, but work that I've been doing on behalf of doctors that were being coerced into being vaccinated against their will or disclosing private medical information against their will in order to remain employed by AHS or maintain their privileges in AHS hospitals. I was up to date, not just from the excellent work that Dr. Bhattacharya has done, but other experts that we've retained, in other cases to respond to some of the goofy evidence that was provided, in the AHS case, including that, oh my God, the pandemic will never be over until every single person in the world is vaccinated. Right? Ignoring, of course, animal reservoirs and all the other stuff that goes on with this, right? So, I've been really concerned about this whole, everybody must be vaccinated against their will or we're going to have COVID forever thing. The reality of it is we're going to have COVID forever. It's a coronavirus. It's going to keep mutating and doing what it's doing, which is what the virus has done from the outset, right? And then put on top of it, you'd mentioned the Johns Hopkins study, but even contemporaneous with the Johns Hopkins study, Theresa Tam herself, through FAC, Public Health Agency of Canada. What a great word for them, frankly. It's like, oh, FAC, not this again, right? So FAC came out with, you can't make this stuff up, I'm sorry. So FAC came out with, a document in July that indicated as early as July of 2021, they were aware that the vaccines were not providing immunity to the disease, and people that had been vaccinated could in fact spread the disease. And the Johns Hopkins study, which followed shortly behind that, indicated that not only could people who'd been vaccinated spread the disease, but they could spread it just as well or more so than people who are unvaccinated. And of course, that's the world we're living in now, where the statistics have all turned, and people that are unvaccinated are actually less likely to spread COVID than people that are double vaccinated, triple vaccinated, quadruple vaccinated. Yet people that are unvaccinated, are still on Trudeau's no-fly list. They're not allowed to get on airplanes. They're not allowed to leave the country by air. They can't get on a train. They can't, use, federally regulated public conveyances, which is to me a huge violation of our Section 6 rights. Along with other numerous other charter rights. But that's the world that we're living in. So all of this is really problematic to me, because if you, from a scientific perspective, can prove that the vaccinated spread COVID more than the unvaccinated, or the same as the unvaccinated, all of the reasons for all of these lockdown orders and vaccine passports and everything else completely go out the window, right? Mm-hmm. So, it's, all of this is very, very problematic to me. And again, this is going to have to be addressed in some fashion in this case that we're involved in, because obviously, we're litigating by Zoom because we have a court that's still maintaining, NPIs, in the face of public health guidance to the contrary. I can't, if you're unvaccinated, you still can't go to the court without, you can't get into the private spaces of the court without a rapid test. And what difference does it make if, the unvaccinated person who rapid test negative, is less likely to pass, is less likely to pass on COVID than somebody who's vaccinated that doesn't have to test, right? So, all of these things remain very problematic to me. And the sooner, people can, that can acknowledge that everything that we've been through is foolish and allow us to get back on, get on with our lives, the happier I'm going to be.
No, that's a great point. In fact, I would say that the fact that we're having a virtual trial over WebEx, a virtual platform, is itself a form of non-pharmaceutical intervention. But I wanted to sort of maybe get into more of a 5,000 foot view of this now. So, as you know, during the trial, there's been various government witnesses, including Dr. Hinshaw, have used the example of Sweden and described the approach that Sweden had taken concerning lockdowns, which is basically diametrically opposed to what's happened in Alberta, and described that as callous and disrespectful and dangerous to the most vulnerable populations. But now a source as vaunted as the CBC only today has recognized, well, it appears that Sweden got it right. So what we're seeing is this the shifting narrative where governments seem to be trying to achieve, to some degree, an elegant exit from COVID restrictions. But what I'm interested to hear from you about, Jeff, is what's causing this shifting narrative, and and is this, I mean, is this a sign that we, those of us on our side of the question, that we're winning, or should we be skeptical and watchful about that?
I always, I think it's an old truism in the context of litigation that, the facts and the truth will generally win out, right? And that facts and truth can be a very stubborn thing, right? And that's what we're dealing with. I mean, we've been saying this from the outset. I mean, quite frankly, I want to give credit to, guys like Dr. Roger Hodkinson, and guys like Dr. Eric Payne, yes, who incidentally is still being persecuted by the College of Physicians and Surgeons for having written a letter to them simply asking them to answer questions with regard to his research and to tell him where he's wrong, right? They're actually claiming that he's spreading misinformation by asking them questions that they never answered.
Is that his letter from September concerning informed consent? So, I just want to say to everybody, if you have not seen that letter, it's 20 pages long, 3 pages it's copiously referenced. It's a brilliant letter. If anyone has not seen that letter yet, Google Dr. Payne's letter and read that letter, because it's absolutely
I think it's still up on the JCCF website. As a matter of fact. So.
Sorry, go ahead, Jeff. Didn't mean to interrupt.
But here's the thing: both, I mean, and more so Roger than Eric, because Eric was, asking questions on behalf of his patients, and Roger from the outset has been saying, look, we need to follow a sensible approach to this. It's got to be based on focused protection, protect the elderly, and then let everybody else that is well suited to surviving this, get on with their lives, so that we achieve, actual herd immunity sooner rather than later. Through the strength of our natural immune systems, bolstered by vitamin D and zinc and, other sensible precautions, that people can take and that Dr. Hinshaw refuses to advocate. Never seen a public health doctor be so averse to telling people to take their vitamins as Dr. Hinshaw. Think about that for a second.
Or eat better.
Right? Oh yeah, exactly. Or don't put it in your mouth.
Yeah.
If you have a BMI more than 30, all of us, all of us could have done a lot better job through the pandemic if we had, some guidance and encouragement. I certainly wouldn't have gotten away with as much as I did with my family had Dr. Hinshaw been in their ear every night about how daddy shouldn't eat so much. So let's be clear here, right? This is the type of guidance that we should be getting from a public health perspective. I mean, whatever happened to participation, if you remember that from when you were a kid?
Oh, yeah.
The Trudeau government should have been promoting public health and public fitness and all this other stuff rather than pissing away $600 billion keeping healthy people at home in their basements or out buying kayaks and, making it you can't buy a paddleboard at any Canadian Tire in Canada because they've all been gobbled up by CERB money. Right? I mean, it was just ridiculous what was going on. Think about how much better off our healthcare system would have been if just half of that money, $300 billion, was put into our healthcare system nationally. Hell, divided in 10. Newfoundland could have had gold-plated hospitals. I mean, give $30 billion to Alberta into our healthcare system to upgrade, our hospitals, go on an international recruiting drive for doctors, nurses, respiratory therapists, whatever it is. Pay our doctors more, pay our nurses more, treat them with respect. I mean, holy crow, we'd be living in a different planet now in the context of, the strain on our healthcare system and hospital morale and all the rest of these things. But instead we were being dealt the foolishness that we were being dealt. And I think largely, because it seems so coordinated, amongst left-wing jurisdictions, be it New York State, Washington State, Oregon, California, et cetera, was it all just left-wing groupthink coming out of, these, large, Democrat-affiliated organizations? Or was the World Economic Forum behind a lot of this? These questions still need to be answered. I mean, July of 2020, the World Economic Forum and AHS proudly announced a partnership, right? And we're still yet to get to the bottom of what that partnership means in the context of how health has been delivered in Alberta, since July of 2020. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, these to me are real issues that remain unanswered, and that's why I think we do need a public inquiry. We keep hearing from our friend, Mr. Parker in court, oh, this isn't a public inquiry. Yeah, you're right, Nick. Maybe we do need one. Mm-hmm. We need a public inquiry into how, we've had billions of dollars taken out of the provincial economy through ridiculous lockdown measures when, at a time when we're cutting doctors and nurses' salaries. They're bringing nurses in from out of the province and paying them double what our local nurses were making. Why didn't you give all the nurses in this province a big fat raise and treat them with the respect that they need to be treated? Mm-hmm. Give doctors a raise. Encourage people in private practice to spend, 2 days a week in the hospitals, helping out in the hospitals, and pay them double to do it. Mm-hmm. That would have taken a lot of strain off of our hospital system. But apparently, Deana Hinshaw, who claims to have the power to do whatever it is required to abate the pandemic, would rather lock us up in our houses, than support doctors, nurses, and the healthcare system into being able to deliver healthcare in a more effective way to the hospitals so that the hospitals weren't being overloaded.
Right.
And I mean, that's not even touching on the issue of the fact that we should have had outpatient treatment, from day one. Mm-hmm. Something as simple as, telling people that are, that have been diagnosed with COVID to take an aspirin a day. Because, there's a study from the University of Maryland, which I actually sent to Deana Hinshaw, by the way, by letter, very early on, that indicated that in and of itself would reduce COVID mortality by 43%. Because, of course, the whole cytokine storm, loss of oxygen phenomenon that kills people with COVID is a result of blood clotting, from the spike proteins, clogging up all of the capillaries, in people's lungs. The actual research and the treatment results seem to be that something as simple as aspirin, would reduce COVID mortality by as much as 43%. So in not doing that, is it fair to say that Deana Hinshaw is responsible for killing at least, 43% of the people who allegedly died of COVID in the province? I think so. But I
So
guess at the end of the day, it's Jason Kenney that's responsible because according to Deana Hinshaw, she didn't make orders. She just gave advice, and maybe she was told not to do that. We don't know.
well, yeah, at this point, perhaps she's become more of a politician than a physician. But um, the way that lockdown restrictions have been translated um, has necessarily been a restriction, and in some cases, an outright denial of constitutional freedoms. And some of these are finding their way actually into statutory law. For example, province of Alberta has recently passed a law restricting people's ability to publicly protest. Now, my question for you is: do you see this? Do you see COVID as part of an orchestrated strategy to restrict individual freedom and individual responsibility, or do you see that as something that has happened incidentally?
I've, since the beginning of this thing, have really resisted going down any rabbit holes and trying to engage in, or entertain, probably for my own sanity, any, what would be termed to be conspiracy theories. And I've tried to, as much as possible, just stick to the facts. I'm a big believer, in the philosophical concept, of Occam's razor, which is, an idea that's been around since the time of the ancient Greeks, and a Greek philosopher by the name of Occam, who said, when you're faced with numerous competing, hypotheses, the simplest and most direct answer, is usually the best. The problem that I have, and I was joking around with a client of mine, a poor little Latin professor from the U of L that was let go because he didn't want to disclose his medical information with regard to his vax status. He and I were talking one night, and I jokingly said, the biggest problem I have with all of this is when you apply Occam's razor to the problem, maybe there really is a cabal of billionaires sitting in Switzerland wanting to kill us all, right? But, in all seriousness, and I'm just kidding when I say that, is there some broader conspiracy afoot? Or, were public health officials, like Deana Hinshaw, like Theresa Tam, politicians like Justin Trudeau, did they just see this as a great opportunity, under the concept of, don't let any crisis, go to waste, and that they ramped this thing up beyond all forms of common sense to make structural changes to our lives and democracy under the guise of public health in a way that we're never going to get rid of them. And that's when I was concerned, listening to you doing your excellent cross-examination of Dr. Hinshaw in and around, the concept of the new normal. According to them, the new normal is that we all now live under some form of medical dictatorship where anytime our hospitals are put under any form of stress because they've grossly been underfunded by our governments, because they would rather piss money away on things like CERB and elsewhere, right? Anytime our hospitals are put under stress, they can simply lock us up in our homes as a risk mitigation strategy, right? The logic there, is frightening. So, oh my God, we've had too many traffic accidents this week. Let's order everybody to leave their cars at home this week and walk because, we all, not only will no people die in car accidents, but it'll have the added bonus of mitigating greenhouse gases. Who knows what foolishness they're going to come up with next? That's a bit of a facetious example, but that's, applying the principle of reductio ad absurdum to, what Deana Hinshaw was saying in court. That's where that leads us, right? And where do we draw the line between, 400 people in ICU beds during a normal flu season and 580 or whatever people in ICU beds at the peak of COVID? And at what point do we not get locked down during every flu because Deana Hinshaw has determined that this is a novel flu virus? Well, guess what? Every flu virus is novel because they all mutate in the same way as coronaviruses. I don't even know that, and this is an interesting legal question, whether the orders that we currently are under cover off the variants. Because it was a novel virus has been identified. Well, have they identified any of these viruses as being novel or requiring, society to be locked down or requiring these measures? I would almost think that, there needed to be, sort of an update of the novelty of the virus with every order that came out, rather than just relying on the initial finding with regard to the wild strain of COVID. I mean, this whole thing to me has just been ridiculous from start to finish.
I want to ask you a little bit about the charter, Jeff. As you know, the charter turned 40 yesterday, and the consensus of opinion among lawyers and the public is that the charter is going through some troubled times. We had Brian Peckford on this program recently. Of course, he is the last living signatory to the charter. As you know, he drafted parts of it, including Section 7 and 15 and Section 2, and also was very involved in the development of the Section 1 formula, which he says has been really inverted and perverted by courts. And added on to that, there was a recent op-ed in the aftermath of the Freedom Convoy from our former Supreme Court Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin, where she basically said that Section 1 is the only right and that it trumps all. And then more recently, we had our current Chief Judge, Judge Wagner, saying basically that the acts of the Freedom Convoy were anti-Canadian terrorists, essentially backing up all the things that Prime Minister Trudeau said about them during the Freedom Convoy. So my question for you is, we haven't enjoyed a lot of success in court in charter cases involving COVID recently. Do you have an explanation for that? And is there hope for the future?
Well, it's kind of a tough one, because as as people who litigate in the courts, and obviously we're going to be making applications to the Supreme Court, I'm sure, in and around these issues, and we'll be appearing in front of Justice Wagner. So I think that a certain degree of decorum.
Get on your tap shoes, Jeff.
Your court benches is in order, but let me start with Beverly McLaughlin, right? Who, as far as I'm concerned, was making statements that were purely political in nature, not legal. It's really sad for me that that Beverly McLaughlin is literally in the pay of the communist Chinese with regard to work that she's doing in Hong Kong. Attempting to put lipstick on a pig in terms of the human rights abuses in Hong Kong. And she's now decided that she's going to lecture the rest of us on rights and freedoms in Canada, having taken her 13 pieces of silver from the communist Chinese. So I have a few issues in and around the statements that that former Justice Beverly McLaughlin made, and I certainly don't think that they do her any credit, and it really hurts my heart given the amount of respect that I had for her as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada.
Me too.
My concern is that the issue from start to finish in the courts has been overly politicized. It's being treated as a political issue and not a legal issue. And, fundamental bedrock principles, that we all thought, applied to the charter. And for the record, I'm firmly in Premier Peckford's camp, on those issues with regard to, Section 1. It seems to me that the courts are flipping Section 1 on its head, and putting the onus on the applicants to prove somehow or other that the infringements of rights, are unreasonable, and effectively forcing us to go through a form of Wednesbury test, that the decision has to be so unreasonable that no reasonable decision maker could come to that decision, which is the standard, of judicial review in an administrative decision, but it's certainly not the standard of review with regard to Section 1 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which puts the onus on the government under the Oakes test to demonstrate, beyond a balance of probabilities, right, that they took all other measures into account, that these are the least intrusive measures available, et cetera, which, to my way of thinking, has been completely lacking in any of the litigation that we've undertaken. But the courts have been far too willing on an evidentiary basis to simply take the government at its word, as opposed to, holding the government to a far higher standard, far higher evidentiary standard than they've currently been held to. And I mean, that decision of Justice Crampton's in the federal court with regard to airport incarceration hotels, was a good example. He agreed that it was a form of incarceration, but felt the government 3 days was not only more than reasonable. The government could have locked people down for longer if it wanted, and he would have found that to be reasonable. So again, I mean, these decisions to me are really troubling. So you ask me, how healthy, is the charter as it, at the age of 40? I mean, good God. I mean, to me, the charter has emphysema and is on life support, as we speak. And, is in need of a lung transplant to breathe some fresh life back into
multiple comorbidities, right?
Oh God, yeah, no, it's horrid, right? I mean, as somebody who believes in the Constitution and believes in constitutionally protected rights and the rights of the citizen, it's horrifying to me. And I mean, it really reminds me, I think I told you this earlier in a conversation, I studied, Soviet foreign policy as an undergrad, and read quite a bit about, the legal system in the, in the Soviet Union, and human rights abuses and psychiatric abuses in the Soviet Union and so on. And, this is in the face of, the Soviets would always say, and if you read the Soviet Constitution, it was the greatest constitution in the world, the most freedom, the most everything that you could have. But the problem was, of course, in the Soviet Union was that, if people tried to raise their constitutional rights, before they could even get to court, they'd be hauled away and thrown into the gulag. Or alternatively, if they ended up in court, they were in front of judges that were appointed, by the party for the purposes of supporting the party. And it really seems to me that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is undergoing the same type of judicial interpretation, rather than relying on, the early case law like Oakes that was established, near the birth of the Charter, in the context of Section 1. It's now, as long as it's politically appropriate and as long as the government says it's okay, it must be okay, because we all have to live in fear of this virus that's going to kill us all, right? And I find that very, very, very troubling.
So it sounds as though even though the charter has a lot of health problems, there's still life in the body. So if you were going to give some advice or encouragement to people listening to this podcast about how they could best conduct themselves in order to make a difference in the cause of liberty, in the cause of individual responsibility, what would you say to them? What is within individual control that the people can do in their daily lives that might make a difference?
Well, I'm encouraging everybody to continue on with the spirit of the truckers and the trucker movement and make as much noise as you can every opportunity you can. Unfortunately, we're between elections now, but I think people need to be inundating their MPs and MLAs with with correspondence with regard to the violations of rights in this country. You need to start making lists now, in advance of the next election, to make sure that people that stood for the violation of your rights will not be reelected. I mean, as horrible as it sounds, I was telling people, I said, as awful as everything has been that's been going on in Shanghai, with people being locked in their homes and starving to death in their apartments and so on, I would remind people that that would be Rachel Notley's view of Alberta. I mean, I'm firmly, as much as I'm opposed to Jason Kenney's policies, everybody needs to remember that Rachel Notley throughout has only wanted to lock us down harder. And I say, having gone to school with Rachel, we were in the same honors political science program together, that if Rachel was in power when, 15 days to start the spread happened, we would all been fitted with ankle monitors. The front doors of our homes would have been nailed shut like they were doing in China. This idea that, we need to constantly, politicians that constantly are screaming that we need more restrictions rather than less restrictions should not be trusted with our vote, should not be voted into office. And people need to look at those people with the most jaundiced of eyes. And, Jason Kenney, there's no doubt in my mind that he needs to be voted out of office. Unfortunately, UCP now stands for the United Corruption Party. And, Jason Kenney's going to cheat his way through the leadership review and get himself reelected. But, every MLA that wouldn't back up, that wouldn't stand up for the people of Alberta within the the United Corruption Party caucus. All of them need to be concerned that, if we can't, if the party can't be cleansed of its current stench, the current stench of corruption, that, the rural Alberta will rise up and will go to elect another party, other than the Kenny Corruption Party, which is what we're dealing with. And quite frankly, I think if once the data comes out about the degree to which, our economies have been harmed, the amount of unemployment, all the rest of it, if that could just sink in at an urban level, and for people at an urban level to understand that less lockdowns rather than more lockdowns, and better, more funding of public health rather than less funding of public health, and better management of our public health care system, is the direction that we should have gone. Who knows? Maybe maybe we will see, a party elected, that's, that'd be willing to have a referendum, to take Alberta out of Canada on the basis that Canada really does not serve Alberta anymore. And, they're literally out to destroy our economy and destroy us as human beings.
Well, Jeff, you've been very generous with your time and your knowledge, and we're most grateful for that today. This is the part of the program where we sort of close off, and what we do is we try and encourage people and point people in a direction where they can go and further their understanding of some of the topics that we've been discussing. And so we want you to pretend that you're sort of teaching a class. You're going to point people to certain books that you think are valuable, or a certain website. So I want you to consider that for a moment, and I'll give mine, and then I'll let you close off the
Sure.
The homework assignment. So I'm going to suggest that a book that's written by Murray Rothbard called For a New Liberty, the Libertarian Manifesto. And this book is fascinating because it proposes once and for all escape from the two major political parties in the United States, which obviously has application in Canada as well, and looks at a radical alternative that says that state power is unworkable and immoral, not to be curbed and finally overthrown. And then to make his case, he deploys an entire system of thought: natural law, natural rights, Austrian economics, American history, the theory of the state, and more. So what he does is he imagines a society that is governed very, very differently than what we are right now. And the reason why I recommend this book is because I think it talks in great detail about the dangers of state overreach, the causes of them, and the way that things can be changed. So it doesn't necessarily, it does advocate libertarianism, which is of course a very small or non-existent government. But I think it's an important starting point for people to read, just to understand how far government overreach in Canada has gone, and that there is another way of doing things. There is an alternative path, but it's going to have to start with us, with an acceptance of individual responsibility, and placing individual rights and liberty much more higher in terms of a moral hierarchy than they seem to be right now in Canada and in Alberta. So, Jeff, what do you think? Do you have any ideas about where you could point people to further their understanding of these topics?
Well, I think if one of the books that I've been recommending throughout the pandemic for people to read actually is Hannah Arendt's work, Eichmann in Jerusalem.
Oh, that's a great one.
A study of the banality of evil. Mm-hmm. And and it's the same. It's like it's the idea that I'm just following superior orders. I'm not killing anybody. I'm just making the trains run on time, right? Mm-hmm. And it's a great book to read because her seminal work is a book called The Origins of Totalitarianism. Right. But everything that she talks about in The Origins of Totalitarianism, are really encompassed in Eichmann in Jerusalem, sort of as a case study, of that whole project. And one of the things that Hannah Arendt, was advocating, it was very controversial at the time because of the degree to which she implicated the senior Jewish leadership for being complicit in the Holocaust. So, you had, if the senior Jewish leadership would go along and help people get organized and help get them onto the trains and all the rest of the stuff, they would go to Triendestat, which was the sort of the model concentration camp that they would show to the world, where people had their own vegetable gardens and everybody seemed to be very happy, behind barbed wire, et cetera, et cetera. These people that got to go there were the ones that organized people to go to the trains to Dachau and Birkenau and Auschwitz and so on, right? And, what she said was, you have to look at Sweden as an example of non-compliance, where the king stood up the day the Nazis ordered people to wear the yellow star and stood on his balcony with a yellow star on his chest and said, from this day forward, all good, loyal Swedes are Jews. And everybody in Sweden wore the yellow star to emulate their king. And as a result, I think the Nazis, only succeeded in deporting less than 9,000 Jews from Sweden compared to other countries like France, and elsewhere where there was active cooperation from the Vichy French and so on. So, her point was, that where people stand up to totalitarianism and refuse to participate in the exercise, and we've had some good examples of that, like like our pastor that keeps getting thrown in jail, and restaurant owners that are refusing to buckle to the buckle to these ridiculous mandates and so on. But we need more people like that in our society that are willing to stand up and say no. These orders are morally repugnant. They fly in the face of our culture, our society, basic human rights. We're not doing it. And hopefully, when all of this turns around, and if they start trying to mandate, third shots or fourth shots or whatever the hell the vaccine salespeople, within AHS and the federal government, are next deem, the next useless shot that you're supposed to take to do nothing, for a disease that's largely past us, people will remember that and start standing up and making a ruckus, at every turn. And, if nothing else, I think people, should take, inspiration from books like Eichmann in Jerusalem to understand that the totalitarian exercise only succeeds with our involvement, right? To the degree that we all sit down in the road, like Gandhi encouraged people to do in South Africa in the face of apartheid and so on. The entire project for the government, for people that are trying to subject us to these types of dictatorial edicts and totalitarian behaviors, it becomes unmanageable and ungovernable. And as a society, I think we need to look at what's going on with open eyes, and we need to stand up and say no. That's a book I would urge people to read. Another one quickly, is if anybody wants to know what's going to happen to Deana Hinshaw, just read The Prince, and it's the chapter on, is it better to be loved or feared, where the Duke of Lombard set a brutal administrator as a scapegoat to basically subjugate the population. And then once the subjugation was finished, the prince rode in and had the brutal administrator drawn and quartered in the village square, thus regaining the love of the people. So,
right.
We've already had the demise of Verna Yu. I would imagine that, if you read The Prince and you understand the degree to which Jason Kenney is a pure Machiavellian, that's likely to follow. I would urge that to people. I would commend that to people's reading. It also has one of my favorite lines of political philosophy in it, which was talking about the Lombards conquering the Florentines, where Machiavelli commented, and the Florentines were easily conquered, for they had become weak and effeminate from long peace, which is unfortunately where I see us as a society. And hopefully people can get back in touch with their inner libertarians or their inner warriors and understand that that just rolling over for this stuff on an ongoing basis, literally, is a road that will, that leads to the death of freedom, as we've seen in the last 2 years.
No, Machiavelli is, of course, the famous line from Machiavelli also is the end justifies the means, but also that it's better to be feared as a ruler than to be loved. And I think we've seen a lot of that too.
But again, in that same chapter, Machiavelli says, but above all, avoid being hated. And I think that's what Jason Kenney has right now, is that, he's equally despised by people on both sides of the argument. I mean, he's completely despised by rural Alberta, who are just sick and tired of these silly, silly rules and regulations that have been stuffed down their throats. And he's also equally despised by all of the Karens that follow Rachel Notley because they think he wasn't locking down enough and he wasn't hysterical enough.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he has a real political problem, in that regard. He might be able to cheat his way through this leadership review through the degradation of the United Corruption Party. But beyond that, this idea that only Jason Kenney can beat Rachel Notley in an election, I think it's going to be severely tested in the next election cycle.
I think you're
so
right.
That's those are some thoughts there. And then otherwise, if people wanted to get a sense of what our office has been doing on behalf of the province and some of my ongoing wars with the College of Physicians and Surgeons and what I consider to be the medical abuse being perpetrated by AHS, the college, and Alberta Health, sort of all in conjunction with one another. Actually, if you put this one up, it's actually not rathandcompany.com. It's Rathco, so RATHCO, Rathco COVID, COVID litigation.com. So Rathco COVID litigation.com. And most of the letters and documents and things that we've been publishing, and actually it's Rathco COVID litigation.com is all lowercase. No capital R, no capital C, no capital L. So Rathco COVID litigation.com. And a lot of the stuff that we've been publishing from the outset, is there, along with some very pointed letters that we've sent to both Premier Kenney, Rachel Notley, and others, including our recent letter, Leighton, to the Chief Medical Examiner with regard to the need for a public inquiry into all of the suicides in 2021, is posted there, along with other links and resources to the research we've been talking about, including the UC Davis study on the transmissibility of COVID, and so on. And just as a final thought in that regard, everybody needs to get their hands on this latest document dumped by Pfizer, because that'll really underline, to people that care to, even skim that stuff, what a bill of goods we've been sold with regard to these vaccines. Because even Pfizer now is trying to, head for the hills and cover its ass by saying, "Oh, no. We never said the vaccines would cause immunity or prevent the disease from being spread. Oh, no. We only did a 2-month study. We couldn't ever say that. We never said that the vaccines would stop the spread." Okay, well, then let's go back and square that with all the things that we know that, that Dr. Hinshaw has said and that the government has said, as to what these vaccines are supposed to do. And hopefully that'll cause some cognitive dissonance, amongst some of the people who've literally been drinking the Kool-Aid on this stuff, from the outset. So, I'll leave you, with those thoughts. I know these are, very uncomfortable thoughts for people. I know that people that have been vaccinated have a lot of cognitive dissonance in and around, these issues, because you can't be unvaccinated, right?
Right.
You're devaccinated or whatever you want to say. So whatever choice you made, you have to live with. And I think people should be really angry, about the way in which they were forced to make that choice, the lack of information that was provided to them with regard to that choice, and the degree to which we have all been grossly misled by our so-called public health officials in and around the efficacy of these so-called vaccine products. So anyway, I'll just leave you with that, Leighton. And I have to say what a pleasure it's been to be here with you.
Well, it's been our pleasure. I entitled this episode "The Advocate," and you certainly are all of that and a bag of chips. And I'm personally very, very, very grateful for your work, and I hope you'll continue your fight. I know that you will, on behalf of your clients, and really for all Albertans and all Canadians. And thank you so much for engaging us in a deep and meaningful conversation today on Grey Matter, Jeff.
I really appreciate it, Leighton. All the best.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you bet.